My question, though, is what do you think it will take for game movies to step up to the same level? Is it even possible? Both comics and games have been mentioned as their own form of storytelling, but when it comes to movies, one is definitely coming out better. Any idea as to why? A fan since episode 1, Alicia. Is that it?
Yep. Yeah,
well, Alicia, good question.
Pretty apropos this week, considering we played a video game that everybody thought was
better than the
cinematic movie.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's pretty clear problem that movies based on, we have Max Payne movie coming out soon based on a video game, and we had Death Race, which was basically based on a video game.
Well, here's the thing that I think, because you bring up a good point with the Max Payne, because I think Max Payne is probably getting closer to that thing. I think what it's gonna take, unfortunately, is the exact opposite. It's rather than doing stuff to make, video game movies as good as comic book, also Prince of Persia, that could be it. You know what I mean? Making video game movies as good as comic book movies. The reason why comic book movies are the way that they are is because they finally made a movie that the technology was also available to, and cost effectiveness, to be able to do it. May even have been Spider-Man 1, where a movie can make that kind of splash. Then the money will be brought in. I don't think it's gonna be, well, you put the money in and then it'll be successful. I think it's somebody's gotta go out on a limb, make a movie that's based on a video game that is that big summer blockbuster movie. Then all the other video game properties, it's like what we're seeing now with the comic book properties, where it's like the floodgates open and just comic book movies that were very high quality.
I'm missing your point. You're saying that...
My point is, it's not like something that Hollywood is gonna do en masse. It's that one person who's gonna do successfully a major movie that is gonna be based on a video game that's gonna make as much money as Spider-Man did. And then the movie studios will go, oh, it's viable. Then we'll see the big...
Well, I think the reason why this is happening with comic books and hasn't happened yet for video games is because comic books are stories.
So are video games.
My point is that video games are just now becoming stories. The Mario Brothers doesn't have a story. Mortal Kombat doesn't have a story. Those movies were decent budget movies that were summer spectacles that had shitty stories. So they did the box office that kind of movie makes. Batman, Dark Knight, it became so big because yes, it's based on a comic book, and yes, superheroes are big now, but it's a fucking good movie. And that only really good movies make it to the next level. It's not just a moneymaker.
Right, but is that a really good movie because it's based on a comic? That's what I'm saying.
Is it a function of the source material?
Well, what I'm saying is once a video game is made into a really good movie like Dark Knight, then you'll start seeing money and talented people taking on those.
Totally, exactly. That's the point is now I think video games are becoming more story-oriented, where BioShock had a much richer story, and now Gore Verbinski might make a BioShock movie, for instance. Then we might get that.
But what is it? You guys are just saying once we get a good movie. Is there a function of the quality of video games that makes them
they're
more
not
difficult?
Story-oriented. They're video games.
Well, no, now they are.
Now they are becoming more story-oriented.
You don't
but
think
as a function, as a function. The Force Unleashed based on a movie? Yeah, I mean, yes, and I thought it was a great game, but they're not going to make a movie based on... I'm saying...
You should, it'll be awesome.
I'm saying comic books are stories, and they're making movies based on stories. Video games are just challenges. They are games. So making a movie out of Doom, it's not, you don't have a good story to make a movie. You don't get an auteur like Christopher Nolan to make that story.
So I think what you're saying
are becoming more story-oriented. I think we might eventually start to see better directors and better writers drawing from better material.
I just want to say you've just created a new word, story-oriented, which means story-oriented.
Did I say that?
Well, now the episode has a title. So I think you're making an arbitrary distinction. I think you're making an arbitrary distinction because in the same way that video games haven't always been as story-oriented as they are now.
Story-oriented.
Excuse me. Comic books are the same way. If you look at the early comic books, the way that the first Spider-Man movie distilled what Stan Lee wrote in the first Spider-Man story it did it in a way that it built upon sort of the sum total, the amalgamation of what we know of Spider-Man in the, the successive 40 years, 60 years, whatever it was. Those one-off stories that were coming out in the 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s are not the same level of quality storytelling that would sustain a film.
No, the story of the pilot episode of Spider-Man, the story that you're a geeky kid who then has superhuman powers is far more captivating than I'm a plumber who jumps on mushrooms.
It's captivating.
Win. FT.
There's no contest here,
but we're not talking about Halo, we're talking about Gears of War, we're talking about
they haven't made those movies yet. And those are games that.
So you're saying that by the mere function
of saying Halo and Gears of War are we don't play those games for the stories. We've already talked about that on the show.
So you're saying that by the mere function. It feels like you're talking out of both sides of your mouth because you're saying
it's one of his is not out of his mouth. But
no, wait, what do you mean?
Because one side of the argument you're saying those movies haven't been made yet, so those stories are worthy, and at the same time you're saying we don't play those games for their stories, so those stories aren't worthy. You're saying that by the function of comic book stories being worthy of being films, that they will inherently be better quality. And I'm saying that that's not necessarily. It's not a function of comic books that their story is inherently better just by the genre or the media that they come out on.
The medium of comic books
so you guys disagree,
is a storytelling.
Which is fine. You guys can disagree.
The medium of comic books is a storytelling medium.
Correct.
The medium of video games is only now just sort of becoming a storytelling medium.
Genius.
Movies,
Good
storytelling medium.
Wrap up. Done. Thank you.
Story-oriented. Story-oriented.